So we've spent a lot of time sort of giving you an overview of the process, and we've talked a lot about covenant and kingdom, so relationship as well as responsibility, and discipleship and mission. So the idea that our goal is not just to create consumers, but producers. And so the idea that we are investing in people, we are receiving things not for just our own consumption, but rather also to share with the world around us. And so the last few minutes here today, we're going to just talk a little bit more about the mission of the church, the mission of God, especially in the context in which we find ourselves today. And so as we do all the time, we want to start with Scripture, so I'll invite you to open your Bibles with me to Mark chapter 6. We'll read verses 45 to 52. And this is a text that's become meaningful and important to me over the course of time after hearing a colleague of mine give a sermon on it a number of years ago. The content that he shared from it just deepened my perspective on it and has helped me think about what the mission of God really looks like today. So Mark 6, verses 45 to 52, he writes, "Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd." So this is immediately following the feeding of the 5,000 on the mountainside. And so Jesus has had this miraculous production of food for all these people, and then he dismisses them and sends out his disciples in the boat. Jesus goes up on the mountainside to pray. It says, "When evening came, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. About the fourth watch of the night, he went out to them walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. And they cried out because they all saw him, and they were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, 'Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid.' Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves, and their hearts were hardened." And so what's helpful in sort of understanding this context of the disciples is to understand the historical context in which Mark was writing this gospel. And it's highly likely that he was writing this gospel to the Gentile believers in Rome around 70 AD, when Nero was the emperor in Rome. And what was happening in that time was that Nero was persecuting Christians systematically. We talked a little bit about that earlier today, but feeding them to the lions for sport. People gathering to watch this atrocious thing happening. The reason that Nero was going after the Christians was because there was a fire in Rome, which Nero attributed to the Christians. He blamed them for this fire. Historians interestingly suggest that perhaps Nero set the fire himself, just used the Christians as a scapegoat and a reason to go after them. And so this text is written in a context in which the early Christian church recognizes the tenuous circumstances that they are in. They have to experience the feeling that Jesus has abandoned them. He's up on the mountainside praying. They're out there in the middle of the lake rowing this boat by themselves. And the scripture talks about how the wind comes up and the disciples are straining at the oars. That's in verse 48. Another possible translation of that text is the disciples were being tortured by the oars. And I don't think that language is accidental either. I think Mark is very particular about that language that he's chosen there. And so there they are, being tortured by the very tools that they've been given to row themselves across the lake. And Jesus, it says in the middle of the night, sees them, which is a hint as to what Mark wants to communicate about God in this circumstance. And so Jesus, when he sees them being tortured by the oars, goes walking out on the lake, and he was about to pass them by, and it tells us what the disciples' reaction was to that. They're terrified because they think this is not Jesus, this is some ghost coming out to do them in. That was the Jewish tradition, was that at the point just before death, a ghost comes out to take you onto the beyond. And so they're out there being tortured by the oars, and they're looking at this apparition walking across the lake going, we are about to be completely and utterly exterminated. I think that's how those original readers would have heard this. They would have completely identified with the disciples because they understand what it feels like to have the entire foundation of their world uprooted. It's like this giant earthquake is happening around them, and there's nothing they can do about it except simply try to maintain their boat in the middle of this giant storm in which it feels like they're about to die. What I think is significant about this is we don't necessarily experience that type of persecution or that type of upheaval, but there certainly is a sort of a cultural earthquake happening around us, isn't there? We live in a time in which the things that we as people previously had held on to don't have the same meaning, or they just don't carry the same weight. The values of culture over time shift. And the older we get, the more we recognize how things change around us. And sometimes it comes in the form of natural disasters. This is a picture from Haiti following the earthquake in 2010. Some of you also recall where you were on that day, September 11, 2001. I was in seminary, and I remember going to a gas station, and it was the days in which you actually had to go inside the gas station and pay for your gas. And the person at the counter had the TV on behind him, and they had actually let us out of class early to go home. And so I commented to this guy, man, it's crazy what's happening. And he just sort of looked at me at this point, didn't say anything. I went, wow, his world, our world changed forever today. And now think about all the things that have happened since then, right? So these two really big, tragic events. But we could also mention the stock market crash in 2008, the finance and banking industry that has been changed forever as a result of that, or the current events of immigration, a wall, government shutdown. I mean, these are things that are happening right here, but then there's also, of course, if you're following international politics, the Brexit vote and Theresa May and the vote of no confidence. I mean, the world is in upheaval. We are experiencing a cultural earthquake, I think almost unlike any we've seen in the history of the world. What happens is people find all sorts of anxiety as a result of those institutions shifting. And so we talk about it on a world level, but if you listen carefully to your neighbors, you'll find that those world shifts play out in individual ways around us as well. For example, my friend Chooch, who, it's not his real name is Mark, but since he was a little kid, he was called Chooch. He used to work in the finance industry and got laid off a year and a half ago and has been looking for work without success. And he's not an old guy, he's my age. I'm not an old guy, it may surprise you. I'm in my young 40s. And so here's a guy in the prime of his career, and he can't find work. The foundation in which he had found his identity has changed. And the impact that has not just only on him, but also on his family. So, his wife, who had been primarily staying at home with the kids, now picking up extra work, and their kids, who are young, like my kids' age, 5, 6, 7, now all of a sudden their culture has shifted, and there's a whole lot of anxiety in that house that wasn't there before. These big culture shifts have impacts on the lives of the people around us. And what happens is, in the past, maybe a generation ago, or maybe a little bit more, when significant shifts like this took place, people would look for meaning. And they would look for that meaning and place and settling in the church. Right? My parents raised us with church as a central part of life. And we came from a town, in a county, in a state where everyone, it seems, had that same experience. But today, the church has kind of been pushed from the center of society to the outskirts of it. And so when people start to look for meaning and place and purpose, they're not looking to the church first. They're looking elsewhere. In fact, statistics, you can interpret statistics all you want. But some of the lower statistics indicate that less than 1/4 of all Americans attend church on a weekly basis. People are not looking to the church for meaning. It's one of those structures of society that has shifted in their mind and can no longer be counted on for the things that it had previously provided. And so those of us who are raised in the church look at the culture around us and go, it's the culture that's shifted, and we can't count on them for anything anymore either. And the thing that we look back on with meaning, we long for the way the church used to be, how it was always at the center, and people loved the church, and people loved Christians, and we were walking together towards this Christian ideal. And so whenever you encounter a shift like that, we sort of have this tendency to circle the wagons, right? To become self-focused, to preserve ourselves. Our cultures do it, our churches do it too. And so we look at how the church has responded and is responding, and it seems that that's one of the tendencies that we have as well. To say, well, culture has abandoned us. We as a church are going to focus on the people that are here. We'd rather survive with what we have than take a risk and be rejected by the culture that's left us. Meantime, our culture is going, that's fine, we can't count on you anyways, and they're turning more and more inward and saying the church has no meaning, and it's best if those Christians just stay out where they're at. So the question remains, well, in such a time of significant shifting, who can we really count on then? Who can we really trust? The culture is asking it. Churches are asking it. Leaders are asking it. Where do we go? What do we do? How do we respond? Well, if you recall how we started yesterday when talking about covenant and kingdom, we identified that since the beginning of time, we've been commissioned to be in relationship with the Father, as well as acting on his behalf as rulers with the responsibility of the kingdom, to continue to enact that great rescue mission that was started at the fall, Genesis chapter 3. And so we're faced as followers of Jesus with a couple of options. We can retreat. We can circle the wagons. We can essentially close our doors and keep inside the people that are already there, and we can ignore all of the shifts happening around us. We can do that. If we do that, I think it's pretty clear what the outcome is. Or we can respond to the invitation of Jesus, who has called us to be a covenant family with a kingdom mission. We have the opportunity, we have the invitation, we have the authority and the power to be the rescue team to a culture around us that is experiencing historic changes. And I want to offer you some suggestions on what that might look like for us as a church in this culture where so much shifting is happening. The first thing that I think we get to show to our culture today is compassion. You may be familiar with the old axiom, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. The opportunity that we have as a church is to show our culture, to show our communities, to show our neighbors that we do care about them. And that we don't care about them just as peasants, but that we care about them as people. Our nature, in times of fear, is to become paralyzed, right? So a little backyard farming lesson that I learned. We, a year and a half ago, bought a house. The house that we lived in, 2 houses before that, we've done a lot of moving since our time here in Colorado. That house had a large backyard that we had terraced gardens in it, and in the back, right by the alley, we actually had a chicken run. And I'd never had chickens before, but man, was it fun. 5 or 6 chickens, several of them we got as babies, and so you're waiting for them to become layers. And the first day that you go out to the hen house and open there's a teeny tiny little blue egg. It's like, oh, they finally arrived. Well, one of the things that I observed about chickens is how they react to danger. And so we had an open run, and I remember being out there pulling weeds or something like that. And one day, there was this big hawk that flew in and sat on one of the fence posts. And it just sat there very calmly watching my birds pecking at the ground. And I was like, I kind of want to see how this plays out. Sort of felt responsibility. I should shoo the hens back into the house where they're protected, but I was like, I just kind of want to see what happens. And so the hawk is sitting there watching them like a hawk. Seriously, I mean, I learned so much just by watching farm animals. And eventually, it's like one of the chickens recognized there was danger. And do you know what chickens do when they sense danger? They freeze. They do nothing. I thought they're going to squawk, they're going to alarm the rest of the flock. No, their fear response is paralysis. And sometimes I wonder if we as Christians and as the church have the same fear response. We are afraid of culture. We are afraid of our neighbors. We're afraid of our community. And so we sit there and go, maybe we should do something, but it's kind of scary. And so one of the first steps that we get to do is to show our neighbors that we care, to have compassion for them. And the first way that we do that is not doing anything, but rather just opening our ears and listening. Because we have to develop some grand plan to help our neighbors. Well, where do we start? I don't know. What do you think? Well, maybe we should just take a year to listen. Take your neighbors out to coffee, invite them over. Say, hey, we're going to have a barbecue. You like hamburgers? No? How about veggie burgers? Yes, great. Come on over. Come spend some time with us. Get to know us. And just tell us your story. One of the opportunities that we've had since we came here is to do that, is to listen to our neighbors. And one of the most significant moments for us came when my wife, following the election of Donald Trump as president, came when some of our neighbors were just terribly beside themselves at this. And so we grew up in a very conservative, politically and socially community. And so there were a lot of our family members who were very happy at the outcome of the election. We, however, live in a neighborhood in which a lot of those people were not happy at the outcome of the election. In particular, some of the women in our neighborhood. And so they were so upset that they started to organize a plan to go to Washington for the Women's March that happened on the same weekend as the inauguration. And they said, Janine, my wife, will you come with us? She came home and she said, well, so this happened today. I said, well, what are you going to do? And she said, I'm conflicted about this. But ultimately, she said, in honor of this relationship with my friend who has invited me to walk with her and to listen to her, I will go. And so she did. And it's been one of the most significant relational things that she could do because her friend recognizes she may think differently and yet took the time to honor that relationship and to extend compassion to her as a friend. One of the opportunities we have as people going out on a rescue mission is to, first of all, show compassion for the people we live with. The second thing we get to offer them is community. Community. It's an opportunity for us to show people and to help them experience the togetherness of life. I referenced earlier that what happens when things shift is normally we retreat. And when the institutions that you're familiar with, or in the case of the picture we showed earlier, if a building becomes unstable, you don't go in it. Right? You stay out. And to culture around us, the church is one of those institutions that is unstable, and so they don't go in it, they stay out. And we look at our neighbors with fear, and so we don't go out to see our neighbors, we stay in. And that's what's happened. I reference our friends Chooch and his wife Shelley. After Chooch lost his job, we don't see them. Like I see them at the gym on occasion, but they have stopped reaching out and have just sort of circled the wagons, and they've simplified. So they used to have 2 cars, they sold 1. And sometimes people, I had other friends in the past who have lost jobs, they downsize, right? They sell their house, buy something smaller, and they retreat. And they try to figure this out on their own because people are embarrassed when they go through struggles. I'm embarrassed. Probably you all have the same experience. Our culture is the same way. When we experience trials and challenges and struggles, we tend to think we just have to get through this and then we can be normal again. And yet, as people following this call to mission, we get to reach out and express to our friends and our families and our neighbors that, look, you don't have to experience this by yourself. We can show you another way to be a part of community that provides connection besides the things that you think don't work anymore. And so Jeff has talked a little bit about the idea of missional communities, and basically that's what we're talking about, is creating a space for people to belong that provides meaning and gives them safety in that type of community. It's basically we're creating an extended family for people to belong to. One of the opportunities along those lines that we've had is, as I mentioned, we do this garden mission in our community. And we've met several people who love gardening, in particular one of them named Angie. And when we first moved to town, she met us. She lived 2 doors down from our first address, one of 6 since we moved here. And we met her one day, and we were talking with her about her family, and she had a daughter named Hallie, who was born with some serious heart defects. And something about those defects impacted her ability to breathe. And so shortly after she was born, she was immediately put into the NICU, the ICU for kids. And they were really not certain that she was going to survive. And the doctors told Angie and her husband basically that even if she did survive, her chances of living into adulthood were very slim. Angie was explaining to us that something about the atmosphere here in Colorado protected this child. We were smiling because I told you this story a couple weeks ago. This is just the part one of the story. And so she was expressing that somehow something occurred in that space that her daughter survived, and she is now in college. And so in that space, I said, Angie, wow, that's incredible. It sounds like God really was looking out for you. And she said, you know what? If God shows up, I'll let you know. And she walked off on my front porch and thought, wow, okay, that's an indicator of where our community is at with regard to the church and to us as Christians. And we stayed in relationship with Angie because she loves gardening, and she would volunteer a space along the side of her house for us to grow food in. And eventually she became the person that started all of our seeds for us. And she would operate alongside of us without expectation of pay because she loves food and she loves us, but she's still trying to figure out this God thing. Well, in the midst of that, she got divorced, and she had some, she would say, a mental breakdown, where she tried to commit suicide in her own home. She was unsuccessful. We stayed in relationship with her, and over the course of time, watched her grow as a person and overcome some really hard stuff in life. And a year and a half ago, she was sitting in my living room, because one of the things that my wife does at the holiday season is she makes these handmade wreaths to put on like your front door or above your fireplace. And she calls in everybody she knows to come and help her. So Angie was one of the people she called in to come and help her. So we're eating lunch one day on one of the days that they're volunteering. And Angie said to me, so you know Rob? I said, yeah, I know Rob. Rob's a friend of hers that had been to our house. We do soup nights, Thursday nights. All these people come in. Yeah, I know Rob. She said, we're going to get married. I said, surprise, that's great. I didn't know you were that serious. And she said, yeah, we've been kind of off and on for the last year, and we finally decided we're going to get married. And so this is, early November. I'm like, great. When are you getting married? She said, winter solstice. Okay. She said, Rob, he loves all those, pagan things, and so he wanted to get married on the shortest day of the year, the darkest day of the year. Cool. Where are you going to get married? Could we do it here? And I went, you mean like here, as in my house? She's like, yeah, we could make it a part of soup night, which happens every Thursday night. And I'm like, okay. Sure. And I said, you know that I'm a Christian pastor, right? She's like, yeah. And we want God to be a part of it. So we should probably talk about that. So she and Rob and I got together and talked about that one night. And on December 21 last year, we had a wedding in our house, a candlelight service. And there were like 50 people from the neighborhood jammed in there. And it was an opportunity for me to talk about John 1. Jesus is the light of the world. Darkness never overcomes it. And so there in that space, while she mistrusts the church and is unsure of God, she found a safe community to which she could belong and explore some of the things that she's thinking about. We have the opportunity to create community amongst people, safe places for them to work out their faith or their lack of faith amongst safe, trusting people. Third thing that we get to do is we get to provide a connecting story for our community. When things that we previously trusted in start shifting and we can no longer trust them, it messes with our identity. It messes with our story. You know how your story is tied to place and tied to structures? Like I said, for me, I grew up in a small town, in a small county, in a small state where everyone was Christian. That's a part of my story. If the church goes away, it impacts my story, and it makes me question, well, who am I, really? And how do I fit in with the greater narrative? Why are we here? People start to ask those sorts of questions. What is the narrative, and how does my narrative fit within that greater narrative? Who are we, and why are we here? And so that's one of the opportunities that we have, is to find creative ways to connect the stories of our neighbors with the story of God. And what's interesting about that is when we do that, people are in awe, because they find that how could that possibly be that God makes room in this big world story for someone as little as me? How is it possible that I could be so significant as to have a paragraph or even a page in the story of God? The thing is, when cultures shift like that, it creates all kinds of opportunities for us to find connection points. We were talking about that at lunchtime. When tragedies or surprising things happen, people open up a lot more. And last summer, we had the opportunity to sit on the back porch with Chooch and Shelley, significant people in our community, along with some other neighbors, Jim and Erica. And we were sitting there, just barbecuing, a casual Sunday night kind of thing. This happens a lot in our neighborhood. And I remember at one point, Shelley got up from the table and went inside. And we were talking about something meaningless, people just shooting the breeze, right? And Shelley came out with a bottle of vodka in her hand and tears on her face. And everyone got very quiet. She set the vodka down on the table and she said to her husband, Chooch, I just got a text that your high school friend died. Somebody that had been in hospice for a long time, that they had been anticipating something like this happening. But it's always a shock when something like that happens. And so they started to tell the story of their friend in Oregon who had just died, and they passed the bottle of vodka around, pour one out for, I can't remember her name. But what was interesting is that Jim and Erica, who were also sitting at a table, had just come back from China a couple of years over there for a work assignment. And while they were there, Jim had to have open heart surgery. And he said, you have something like that happen and you realize how short life is. And then he looked at me and he said, you're a pastor. You deal with life and death all the time. What do you think? And I went, pass the vodka, let me tell you. But all of a sudden I had an opportunity to talk about, this is how we as Christians look at grief and death and dying. And yeah, it really sucks. And at that moment, you enter into a period of grief, and that's okay. But I said, as a follower of Jesus, we don't grieve as those who believe this is it. There's something more, and it impacts how we live today. I just sort of went, that was interesting. And a week later, Shelley came up to me and she said, I didn't realize in that moment how special that time was. We have the opportunity to connect people to the story of God, and it can happen in the most unplanned, unanticipated ways. All we have to do is be available and be ready. The last thing that we get to do is provide a compass. In an earthquake, the topography changes. In a cultural earthquake, the things that you used to use as points on a map, like this gives us our bearing, are gone. And so you start to go, I'm not quite sure where we're going, nor how we're going to get there. And so as a church, as followers of Jesus, we have the opportunity to be the compass for our communities. And that's what happens here with Jesus and the disciples in the boat. And for the word of Mark, who is connecting with the people of the time, recognizing the desperation that they find themselves in, thinking that they're about to die as they see this apparition walking on the water. And it's at that moment that Jesus speaks to them and says, do not be afraid, it is I. And if you read the Greek text, if you geek out on that kind of thing, it actually says, do not be afraid, I am. The same words that God spoke to Moses when he said, when I go to Pharaoh, what shall I tell him? Who is sending me? I am. I am is sending you. And Jesus is saying, I am. God is with you in the midst of this storm. And oh, by the way, God is now sitting in your boat with you, helping you in your torture against the oars. And oh, by the way, this is the God who can calm the storm, and will do so. And so as we present that connecting story to our friends and neighbors, we also get to point them in the direction and help them navigate the storms and watch as God comes alongside of us and comes into our boat in the person of Jesus and calms the storms alongside of us. We get to do that. We get to do that. You don't have to. You can retreat. You can turn chicken. Or you can respond and step out and extend those things to your neighbors. Compassion, community, connecting story, and a compass. This is the way. Walk in it. I'm going to give you just a few moments to reflect on that. I think we're up to break time. Yeah. We'll take just a couple of minutes if there's anything that's on your hearts that you want to share with the room, and then we can go to break. But let's just invite the Spirit to bring anything to the fore that